I'm going to strip the back.
Oh, okay.
Hello, everyone. So thanks for joining us today. We are live in Detroit, Michigan, and then DL is in Colorado. You're joining us here for the Facebook Live with Leadership event, where we're just going to provide an update on our thinking and idea generating for the strategic imperative for racial justice. We've been spending some good quality time engaged in dialogue as ACPA members about your reactions and feedback. Prior to us talking a little bit more about what we've been doing so far, we just wanted to start with some brief introductions. So I will start. So welcome, everyone. I'm glad you're joining us. My name is Steven, and I'm currently the ACPA past president, and I'm also an associate professor in the Student Affairs and Higher Education program at Miami University.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Acco. I serve as the assembly leader for practice within ACPA. I also work at the University of Utah as the associate director of housing and residential education, and I'm an active doc student in the educational leadership.
Good afternoon. My name is Dian Squire, and I'm affairs at Northern Arizona.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Beard Jacob, and I currently serve as intercultural at The Ohio State University. And I'm also a PhD candidate in cultural studies at George Mason.
Hello, I'm Andrea Domingue. I'm diversity inclusion at Davidson College.
Hi, I'm Flo Guido. I am a professor emeriti at the University of Northern Colorado. I'm a senior scholar at ACPA.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Lange. I am a doctoral student at the University of Iowa in the higher education.
And good afternoon, everyone. I'm DL Stewart, professor at Colorado State University and co-coordinator of the Student Affairs and Higher Education programs, and also, along with Flo, serve as an ACPA senior scholar.
Thanks, everyone. So let me provide some context about what we've been doing since yesterday evening. So in order to organize ourselves, there are some readings that we shared. We have read the Grace Lee Boggs book, The Next American Revolution, to provide some historical context for the site of Detroit, and to just inform our thinking about the importance of history, of setting the stage for our time here today. We've also been engaged in some readings on decolonization, from E. Tuck and Yang, as well as some other pieces, just to understand this notion of decolonization not being a metaphor, and how do we not appropriate this concept, but what does it mean to actually think differently about how we do the work of decolonizing our profession, the association, etc. And so having read those pieces as context, we started last night with just figuring out how to best utilize our time together. We spent some time dreaming, imagining of what this space might look like, of thinking through the terms racial justice and decolonization, how we're grappling with understanding these concepts. Part of our time also included a reflection on just thinking about what stood out to us about the various readings that we've had, what are the questions that it prompted us. Many of us around the table talked about how we felt really unsettled by this notion of thinking of ourselves as settler colonialists and not really wanting to adopt that mentality, but what are the ways in which we even if we're anti that how do we reinforce that in some ways? And so the Tuck and Yang piece really pushed us to really grapple with that. And so we invite you all to also engage with that, to see the ways in which we might be complicit in some of the very practices that we're seeking to. We also looked at some of our foundational student affairs documents, the student personnel point of view, learning reconsidered, just to understand how these documents have guided our profession, what's the need behind these documents, what was the current context in which these documents were developed, to help us think about us, why now, thinking about what brings us to the table here today to be trying to propose another document to guide our profession, but this time specifically around racial justice and decolonization. And then this morning, we spent some time in individual reflection responding to the question, what does operating from a racial justice and decolonized lens look like in our practice? So we spent about an hour just reflecting individually on that question as a means to then come together and share out some story sharing about what were some of the differences and commonalities in what we did during that time. And then what brings us to this point now is we spent the latter part of the morning and the early afternoon really just thinking about this framework of imagining what this might look like around our vision of racially just and decolonized ways of being higher education. So that's kind of what we've been doing the past, 24 hours or so, just engaged in dialogue and community with each other, story sharing, and just really pushing ourselves to be vulnerable and share deeply about some of our fears, some of our doing this work. And so having said that, I'm going to turn it over now to Rachel, who's going to provide a little bit more context about what we've been talking about.
Stephen. So as Stephen mentioned just earlier this morning, we have just now started to think about what are the various components that we would like to include within this guiding document. What are some of those concepts? We've started to conceptualize what those might be, and that's part of what we're hoping for, to share a little bit about that with you all today and receive some of your feedback so that we know if we're missing something or what we should be thinking about as we continue on in this process. I'll give you a brief overview of what those components are as of this point. And those items will continue to evolve over the next day and over the coming weeks as we're writing this document. So first and foremost, we want to address why now. So why this particular document, what has brought us to this point, and in particular, what brought ACPA to the point of adopting the strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization. I plan to talk about some of that history, as we recognize that history is a really important component of understanding how we move forward. One of the next components that we're hoping to talk about is where we are now. Situate us here, as you're seeing us here in Detroit, outline some of our process, and also talk about why this particular guiding document is needed. As we were reading and discussing Grace Lee Boggs' book, one of the quotes that helped to move us forward from some of that conversation, I'd like to read for you as we then move into the next components. So Grace Lee Boggs, on page 21 of the introduction of this book, there's a quote that says, we need to have a clear sense of what is dying, what is growing, and what has yet to be born in this phase of transition. We must move toward the future, lacking a clear-cut blueprint of what is to be done, and shedding a dogmatic sense of the eternal truth, but carrying with us a shared sense of the awareness, values, methods, and relationships necessary to navigate these uncharted waters. That was one of the quotes that helped us to think about where we might want to go next, and really to also think about what our past documents have told us, which is really a way to be, and start thinking about and shifting toward talking about a way of being. And so we have since resonated with those last four components that Bob shared around awareness, values, methods, and relationships, and hope to talk about racial justice and decolonization through those various lenses, about who we need to be through self-awareness, how we need to approach this work, what values we hold, Central to that has been many conversations we've had around the value of love and how important love is within that. Then moving towards thinking about methods or examples or strategies, frameworks for possibilities about what can be and how we actually put some of these ideas into action, how we might do this on our own campuses, and then addressing the importance of relationships within that. And it's our hope then by talking about those things that those will lead us toward greater capacity for humanization, radical democracy, and critical consciousness. So those are some of the ideas of where we're at now. And I'd like to next turn it over to Alex to share with you all some of the ways in which we've begun visualizing those ideas.
Oh, sharing. Where'd you go? Keep smiling so it works. It's gonna happen. There we go. Okay. So as you should see on your screen now, as both Stephen and Rachel discussed this morning, we've really been focusing on what does this look like, what does this feel like, and how is all of this done? And so we've come up with sort of this possibility framework for racial justice and decolonization that you see in front of you. And I will start with a caveat that even before we went live, we are still rethinking what this image looks like. But we wanted to have something to present to you all at this time to have a sense of where we are in our work right now. So as Rachel was mentioning, really this idea of the core of our work is love. And many people, I think, would think of romantic and or amorous love when evoking this particular word. And we are really trying to recenter it and reify its communal nature as a act of quality, sustained care for one another. And that is the only way the work sort of propels forward. Around it are 10 sort of different ways in which we seek to actualize the love. So I'll briefly run through the 10, starting with the upper left, or let's say that's about 10 o'clock. We'll start at 10 o'clock with thinking about responsibility rather than compliance, particularly in the era that we are in sociopolitically and historically around institutions being forced to do particular kinds of work versus what is our responsibility to education. Thinking about educating through problem prosing. So the work of Paulo Freire comes to mind here about how we often seek to deposit knowledge in students and each other, but how is it that how do we have to think differently about addressing systems that continuously change? Questioning the sources of knowledge use. So we talked often about what are the sources of knowledge the field often relies on, and how do we trouble the underlying values of those knowledge sets? As we approach 3 o'clock, we are emphasizing agency and thinking about how we understand the power and the influence that we have in our own circles, and that systems by no means prevent us from taking action where we can. Next is developing genuine relationships with one another across difference. So again, how do we think of racial injustice and colonization as preventing genuine relationships for a variety of people over time that has really limited our capacity to see one another as human. Along with that, centering compassion and healing. So understanding, being attentive to the ways in which history has ingrained trauma into marginalized and minoritized bodies over time. And how do we both heal from that and also enact a sort of present compassion with that? At 6 o'clock, we have an always becoming. So this idea that this work is not settled, this document is not settled, there's always something that we are striving towards in our work. this idea of being grounded in mutuality and watching out for one another. So what does it mean to take care of each other and to see our needs as intertwined with one another rather than distinct and separate? Attending to history and reconciling with the past. As we were discussing before we went live, one of the questions is this part of the framework here or somewhere else? As it stands right now, we're thinking about how history flows into the future and how history really informs all 9 of these other components that I've been discussing. And then finally, suspending efficiency and embracing dialogue. Something that all of our readings talked about prior to the retreat that really resonated with all of us was this idea of pausing, and that dialogue prompts us to pause in ways that are not about efficiency or about staying busy in a culture that values busyness. And as we expand outward from love and those now 10 practices, the hope is that what becomes greater, more actualized is this idea of humanization, radical democracy, and critical consciousness from all of these.
All right, so having said that, before we go to see what reactions, questions, considerations folks have, I just wanted to invite anybody else in the room or DL to, if there's any additional things that you wanted to provide, we go to see what kind of reactions people have. All right, so then now this is the point where in my email where I said we want to hear from you as ACPA members. So this is the point where we invite you to write in the chat box about what reactions you have, what questions you have, and then also just, are there things that we're missing that you think should inform this document, that we're just eager to hear what feedback we have as we continue to develop our ideas and writing.
All of the first year masters joining us today.
Yes, we can image that we come up with.
Part of the thing I did not mention about this model structure or possibility framework is that the intention of the lines being dashed is that they also move in and out of one another. So they're sort of interconnected processes that happen. So while we can see that individually, each one is sort of distinct, the idea is that the framework is open enough where all of these things bleed into one another.
Linda said she's really grateful for this. Patrick asked, did you all talk more?
Hi. So Dre Domain again. I think, one thing I think is really important to us in our conversation is that we're not in a way trying to present a how. But we're very much cognizant that every campus structure, process, relationship with faculty and staff is different. So at least for me, I'll use my I statement as saying, to give a broad answer what that could look like for all, for the sake, college universities. But what I will say is that one thing that we talked about most recently is that we do envision there being a relationship across these constituency groups, especially across intergenerations. So a lot about that being highly important. So I think what that looks like, how it happens, is going to be really different based on what challenges there exist around racial justice decolonization for a campus, what past relationships exist, things like that. So it's hard to give a definitive answer, but we're hoping that at least from what our writing will give a starting point to at least begin the conversation, so that we believe very strongly in the groups that are most impacted in that particular community have the HCP side, what that process is like for them. Does that feel?
Yeah, and I would also add on to Dre's comment that this is not a linear process. This is not something we're giving that we're going to solve in a year and be done with. I think it's really important to remember that this is a process. It is a journey, and it's something that's cyclical. So it's going to continue. And I know instant gratification nowadays, we all want a solution to a problem. So we're not, trying to say, let's all solve this problem, but let's go in together, work together, and, journey along.
I think one of the things that we have kept coming back to is this idea that ordinary people are often the individuals who create change. And so ACPA has started saying, we are the leaders that we've been waiting for. And that same phrase, that same concept is reflected in the final chapter of Grace Lee Boggs' book as well. And so I think that is something that we're hoping to impart to readers of this document as well, is that ordinary people can make change. Within our time here, I think we've named some of those changes and some of those things that are happening on our campuses and work for our campuses, whether that's integrating history texts or texts that highlight readings around decolonization or the dark and feminist epistemology within our grad prep programs, or whether that's revisiting policies about smudging within residence halls. So there are very practical things that we're hoping that folks take from this or are able to envision. And that's why we've talked about this possibility framework, is that we hope that folks envision that, they'll walk through their campuses and notice things differently and then act differently as a way to lead us towards humanization, critical consciousness, radical democracy.
I think that leads nicely into O'Keefe Johnson's question, and they asked, what would you tell student affairs professionals wanting to engage in these practices if they didn't know where to start? I feel that students often want to engage but feel overwhelmed about how it's.
So the question's about where students start or student affairs start?
They asked for both, so where do we start?
So, I think for me, part of it is acknowledging what we don't know. And so I was really struck. I domentioned the reading pieces that we had, and just like the Tupping Gang piece, like moved me in a way that I was not anticipating. Like it just really pushed me in a really uncomfortable way. And I had to pause a number of times because I was, I have this mentality that, you do social justice work, you do racial justice work, like we're made to feel like we're one of the good ones. Like we're an expert in this, like we get it, we understand. And so the places that we don't can really push us. And so for me, I think it starts with just reading and just absorbing knowledge that's out there of things that we're just not aware about. So if we're wondering what does the term settler colonialism mean, then that's an area for us to go investigate and dig. If we're wondering this racial justice, what does that mean? Like that's a place to go as well. And this brings me back to the work that Dian and Lynn did on the syllabus for racial justice and decolonization. Like there's a lot of pieces out there that I think we can really grab onto. So for me, I think it starts with like acknowledging what we don't know, which I think takes a lot of humility to say I don't know something and not feel threatened by that, but then to do something with that lack of knowledge and to engage and read and then have conversation, I think is the place that I would start.
I think I just want to add in, I guess, or tell folks that it is in the Boggs book did bring this up a lot as well, is that there's often this assumption that action or social change that needs to mobilize the masses and what have you. It makes this big, grand gestures, if you will. And I think what I would urge people to consider is that, a little bit of my background around the SJE program at UMass is thinking about your sphere of influence, right? So what influence do you have? And so for me, I'm an assistant dean at a college where I oversee diversity. So my influence is pretty big. Not the biggest, but I have a pretty big range. And so one thing just building upon what Stephen said, reading the same text from, Dian and Tuck, is that I really, for the first time, despite being engaged in this imperative for over a year now, is to really trouble my pedagogy. So I didn't realize, I've been using the word decolonization and, indigenous folks and throwing it in there, but I was more being more additive, but not really truly integrating colonization in my work. So one of the first things I'm going to do when I go back to my campus, to go back to my pedagogy that I do for my trainings with my students, is like, how do I bring decolonization truly in that work in a way that's authentic and that makes sense? And that's going to take a lot of work on my part. So as we were talking, Dian brought some great books as I was putting the books on my Amazon cart for me to do my own work, to be able to put that in my pedagogy for my students. So when I'm thinking about doing my orientation training again, my 500 first-year students, that is definitely going to be in there this time, because that was a huge misstep on my part. So that's a small, tangible example. But again, I think building what Stephen said, it's really about you honoring where you are, what you need to know and grow from, but then looking at your sphere and figuring out what one or two steps can you do right now, and not waiting for a grand gesture to happen.
Right.
Yeah, I think if you look at a lot of the kind of components of this framework, they are personal and they can also be applied organizationally, right? So they start with the individual, from you doing the examination of what does love mean to me? Can I move from an individual love to a communal love, where I see everybody as human, as capable of love, as capable of development? And then how do I go about working with this person or these people and others, kind of doing all of these ways, taking one at a time. But I think a lot of it starts with recognizing where we are maybe needing a little development and grace, loving ourselves as well.
If I might jump in, this is DL again. And just to make a point of note, the Grace Lee Boggs book that we keep referencing is The Next American Revolution, Sustainable Activism for the 21st Century. And one of the things that when I think about when I've been overwhelmed and where that's come from, as I think about transformation and change and justice, the root of that overwhelm for me has often been feeling like it all needs to happen right now. And I need to be like some big part of how it happens, and it's big, right? And so connects to what Dre was saying earlier as well. And one of the things that came out of the text for me that I sort of grabbed onto is Boggs' understanding of revolution as an evolutionary process. In other words, change and transformation happens over time. And this has been said before, so I'm just re-emphasizing it, that it's not all at once. It happens over time. It happens perhaps incrementally, but that is also the process of revolution. And that helps me feel less overwhelmed.
This is Guido, and if I might just add one more thing, I would say that it's a journey, and as DL suggested, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time, and it's probably going to be something that all of us individually and collectively will do for the rest of our lives, in becoming aware and in taking the action that we can in what Dre suggested was our own sphere of influence.
Greatest sphere of influence is our son. Bill Huff asks, I'm wondering if you could speak to how this work plays out differently in organizations where most interaction is digital. Thinking about how ACPA is a community, video chats, emails, phone calls. They would like to discuss framework to doing work remotely, online education, cases like that.
This keeps happening. Dre Domingue again. My immediate thought went to some of the commission work I've been seeing lately. In particular, shout out to the commission, especially educators. For a while, they've been really deconstructing our ways of interacting with each other virtually, and finding ways to bring in a lot of what we do face to face in a virtual manner. So a small example, and I've seen the Commission for Student Involvement do this and things like that, where they actually have retreats virtually. And so they find a 3-hour block of time, they find a 5-hour block of time. Not easy, obviously, we're very busy professionals, but they find that time, and it is the value of those particular groups to have space. I think what's challenging with a lot of virtual bases, especially amongst our association, is that we are often focused on tasks, right? There's not a lot of time for us to work on process and relationships, which we argue is critical to this imperative. And so I think, going back again to the Patel piece, and so for me, great, there's this idea of pausing. And so there's a way in which I think there needs to be a shared value amongst, whether it's the entity groups or wherever it is you're doing virtually, to have time to actually pause and reflect, to have that relationship building and what have you. I do think it's very possible, but I think also part of that is reframing what we do in an interpersonal, face-to-face way, in a virtual way, and realizing there are advantages and challenges to that. There's a lot of, I've seen a few, if people are interested, I'm happy to post a few articles that I've seen that talk about how to reframe social justice frameworks or even racial justice frameworks in a virtual space, but I think it is possible. It just takes a reframe.
I don't know if any of these components are necessarily spatially limited, truthfully. It's really about, like you said, the values that we hold, how we think about our work, how we think work should be done. So really that kind of process piece, I think we can engage in problem posing education in the way that Prairie talks about it in many different dimensions, and in both the classroom and in our student affairs work, in the way that we help students who are having crises, or how we teach student development theory, right? I think these are sort of the ways that we go about doing the work, which lead to humanization, which lead to possibility of radical democracy, which I think will naturally lead to critical consciousness, whatever domain you're in. It really is about sort of reflecting on how you go about doing this work. How do we shift it to make it more equitable, inclusive, historical? Melvin asked us, can you please expound more on the notion of always?
So when I think of this, I think part of our embrace is thinking about multiple paradigms at once in how we think through what we offer, the association and the field, right? And this idea of an always becoming is sort of this understand. I think similar to what Gio said about it's not all going to happen at once, right? So there is a temporal temporal element to this, but there's also always this cyclical process we're going to keep going through in some ways that requires us to always sharpen how we're doing our work. And so we're not trying to get, I think the way we framed it was many of the previous foundational documents said, this is the way to do the work, right? This is the way to do student affairs. And what we are trying to offer is a possibility of achieving racial justice and decolonization. We are not saying this is the only way. And so we're trying to also create something that can, in essence, always come back to itself, that can always be thinking about itself, that is reflective in and of itself. And I would open it to my colleagues if they have more ideas about what I'm saying, because I don't know if I'm fully articulating it, but I'm giving it my best shot.
I think you are. And I think what you're speaking about time and how we shift over time was something that we read in Grace Lee Boggs' book as well, and how she thought about her own activism and how that shifted over time, and how she came back to certain philosophies around Marxism, for example, something which she struggled with and then found new ways to adopt those concepts into her work, her understanding of activism, what activism looks like for her now, what's going to work now and be productive. And so I think we're also acknowledging that evolution that can happen over time within us, within our associations, and within our campuses as well.
I missed Jordan West's question. Sorry about that, Jordan. She asked, I'm curious to know how you discuss accountability in this process as an individual and community.
I can start, and please jump in. I think two of the things we've talked about thus far around accountability, one is around relationships and the importance of having deep, authentic relationships with each other. And we've shared some of our own experiences in having groups of folks or people in our lives who can hold us accountable, the importance of that, the importance of being vulnerable, taking time and pausing to build those relationships. And so I think that's why that relationship component has been and remains one of the concepts that we don't want to lose within this framework. And then I think we've also found some of that reflected in Lee Patel's work around moving toward answerability within our research. And Grace Lee Boggs also talks about the, what was it, Alex?
The epoch of responsibility.
Epoch of responsibility as well. And so we're leaning into those concepts to help us think through that concept of accountability.
John Wesley Lowry asks, how does / will the strategic imperative connect to the mission of ACPA?
So, I mean, I think the mission of ACPA is founded on a focus on student learning, caring about the whole student, and about disseminating knowledge that will inspire the profession. And so to me, it's, this is a question that I think has come up often when we have been engaged in the work around the imperative. And it's hard for me to even know how to do the work around promoting student learning and developing students without thinking about racial justice and decolonization in that practice. Like, to me, that it's embedded in everything that we do. We can't attend to students' learning needs if we're not concerned about the ways in which certain people are left out of that process because of who they are, namely Native and Indigenous folks. And we can't think about student learning if we're not thinking about again, who higher education was historically created for. It was not created with the experiences of people of color in mind. And so to me, it's what it does is it deepens our mission. It focuses it on trying to eradicate, I think, past harms and erasure that has existed in our profession. And so to me, that's how I think we see it as integral in that way, is that we are focusing on this in this moment in time on racially just and decolonized practices, but still through the lens of the larger goal around student learning and development. To me, it's just a matter of like, what do you devote the attention to, and how do you sharpen that attention in a way that I think is intended to create deeper opportunities for racial justice and decolonization to be woven throughout our practices around student learning. So I think that's, to me, how I see it connected to the mission.
So Anthony asks, has there been a conversation around how faculty can supplement this work alongside?
I mean, I think the thing that comes to mind for me immediately is, Mary Lee is right now, first a group of master's students is engaged in this. So that to me is one primary way that faculty can supplement this work, is by inviting the students who we work with on a regular basis into conversation. I'm teaching a class this semester on diversity, equity, and dialogue to first-year master's students at Miami. And we're using the syllabus from convention around racial justice and decolonization as a way to think about the work of the association, and as a way to think about some historical documents in relationship to that as well too. So to me, I think those are two primary ways in which faculty can do that. Some examples of that is we we have students who we're connecting with, so talk to them about how you see the imperative informing your work, about the questions you have. So to me, I think those are just two examples.
If I could, this is Flo. I would also add that I think that some of this work needs to be individual first before we do it as a collective or try to interact with other people that we may need to stop and think. Like, I think the way that we kind of came up with this list where we sat as individuals and thought about what it meant to us and then came into community to talk about it as a group is maybe one way in which as faculty we can continue this work, and actually as anyone could. You could do that as a student affairs professional or anyone in higher education, where you have a community of people who want to grow in this area.
I think one thing I might offer as DL is being willing, and this is, thinking about working alongside our colleagues that are engaged in full-time practice in student affairs, is to join together in the work of unlearning the habits that we have engaged with for however many years, decades even, of our practice, whether that's teaching in the classroom or engaging with students in work outside of the classroom, as we work with graduate students in assistantships, that we need to engage with each other in that process of unlearning and relearning new ways of being, as Alex was talking about earlier.
So I just want to go back. So I'm looking at John's question again. So John's question is about the formal mission of ACPA. So I want to read the mission statement as it currently stands, and then I'll expand upon my point. So currently the mission of the association is to support and foster college student learning through the generation and dissemination of knowledge, which informs policies, practices, and programs for student affairs and student services professionals and the higher and tertiary education community. So to me, when I read that, I see the generation and dissemination of knowledge. The strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization is intended to generate and disseminate new knowledge that has not been previously centered in a more robust and expansive way about people of color, Native and Indigenous folks who, again, have not received focused attention on what our needs are and how they are uniquely different from the needs of folks who hold more dominant identities. So to me, I think what we are trying to do with this guiding document is essentially generate as well as disseminate new knowledge about racial justice and decolonization and how that then informs our work as student affairs educators who are committed to the business of student learning and development. And so again, I'll reinforce the previous point that to me it's a false choice. It's not either we focus on the mission, either we support student learning or we focus on racial justice and decolonization. To me, it's both happen simultaneously. What we're asking our educators and our students to do is to think about, if I'm engaged in the business of student learning, how might that look different if I place racial justice and a decolonizing lens and practice at the center of that? What is added by me doing that? What does that mean for how I might need to do things differently? What have I been leaving out that I am now attending to by including those pieces in my work? And essentially and this goes back to this notion of we're always becoming, how does that fundamentally also make me a different person? How does it fundamentally make me be somebody who I was not previously? So I think that's what we're asking educators to do as they think about the larger mission of the association, is to think about how is that mission more focused and inclusive when we think about it from a racially just and decolonized lens. And so to me, I hope that helps clarify to me, I think, where our mission is deepened by this lens around the strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization.
I do want to get to Melvin's additional question. So from student in the class, what is the ultimate goal of decolonization in student affairs, especially considering how higher education and the university can be seen as vehicles for colonization?
That is a super question. So coming from my background, I actually do research on Native American boarding schools. I'm a descendant of the boarding schools of survivors. I think that education does come with a bit of trauma for Native students, particularly when our, ancestors, grandmothers, grandpas, mothers, fathers were taken from their homes and put in institutions, and they essentially used education to assimilate or colonize them. So there's definitely a lot that comes with education, but I think, and thinking about decolonizing, I know for me, so I personally, there comes a piece of reclaiming, so trying to take back what was once taken from us. So not only reclaiming culture, language, practices, ceremony, but also reclaiming education and what it means to be a scholar and be a student. And I also think it's, a lot of it too is bringing it back to our tribal communities and utilizing it to empower rather than to oppress, as it once had been historically. But thank you for that question. It's a super important thing to think about because, especially in my research, I often think as a scholar, as a Native woman, like it seems kind of ironic that I'm in higher education, right? Because, 50 years ago, my grandmother was in a Native boarding school, and for her, she didn't even graduate 8th grade because she was so turned off of the idea of education, because for her it equated loss, and there was nothing to gain from that. So I think now a lot of young scholars are reclaim that for resiliency and empower our communities.
I think another thing to consider that I shared with the group yesterday that was transformative for me is understanding that schooling and education are two different things.
Yeah.
And so how do we invest more as a field in education? I think often we're invested in schooling practices that are meant to replicate and reproduce structures of society that already exist. And if we want to truly transform society, to transform even ourselves, it requires a different approach that a different kind of education can offer us. And I think too, right, part of the discomfort I think many folks feel when they read the Tuck and Yang article, including my first time reading it, was this idea about land, right? And decolonization, if we continue just to make it a metaphor, without talking about land and how land has been apportioned and taken and monetized and made into property. So I think part of the goal along the way, not the ultimate goal, right? Because I'm even wary of like an ultimate goal, because there's an end point there that would make us then potentially miss how colonial logics are being reinforced again in insidious ways. But part of the goal along the way is figuring out, how do we reconcile these things on our campuses and with ourselves, and even down to how we line item budgets, right? How do we think about spending capital in a different kind of way, and whose capital are we spending, right? Yes.
I have one last question, it seems. We have to give some next steps. But the question is, what are some examples of ideas or languages unlearn?
I mean, one that comes immediately to mind is calling people your tribe.
Oh.
So to me, that's one that I forget where I saw that posted the other day, but it just really struck me. So I think that to me is one thing for us to unlearn.
I don't know if it's unlearning, but it's reframing or rethinking around for student success on our campus is defined as retention and graduation rates, and that's not always. So if that's the only way to it, then who are we leaving out of the discussion? Who are we seeing at, through deficient frameworks or good at?
And I think about, I think we often, students, the indigenous, sometimes, you get there's not enough data to, come up with something. And so I think that's really important when you're thinking about, things like budgets and, space. Just because Native students are the smallest number on campus doesn't mean they don't deserve, visibility. And also, too, I encourage, this is more of a learning rather than unlearning. Maybe it is an unlearning, but just think about the history of your institution, right? So the land that your institution is built on, the local tribal communities in the area, I think it's especially important for those of us at land-grant institutions to think about what truly a land grant means. I mean, it is definitely celebrated, but I think we need to have critical conversations around the history of that and what that means for Native nations.
I might offer something else that we might unlearn, and I raised this in our group conversation, I think last night, are the restrictions and the mandates we put on our students for how they govern themselves. So, often student organizations, in order to be a legitimate, recognized student organization, you have to have a hierarchical leadership structure. We mandate there must be a president, a vice president, and the treasurer, or whatever the configuration might be on your own campus, and that boxes students in to a very particular way of organizing themselves and the work that they want to do together, in ways that replicate settler colonial logic, right? And so that's one piece of, Dre was talking about spheres of influence. For those who work with student organizations, that's one piece that can be changed. We start where we are. It's just another example to add on to the really good ones that have already gone forward.
Yeah, and this is flow, and I would add that it kind of goes back to where we started the conversation. And Stephen was talking about, I think we need to maybe unlearn that as student affairs educators, that we have all the answers, and I'm not even sure we know what all the questions are. So I think that we really need to stop and be very thoughtful about the language that we use, the fact that we don't have answers, the fact that maybe students have more answers than we do, and that we need to rely more on them for looking at and examining some of the issues we face.
And I just think I'll add one more piece, and then I'll close our time here today. I also just think a lot about, as a cis man, my voice is given a lot of space. I also take up room even if I don't ask for it, and so reflecting on the ways in which I think unlearning the ways in which we perpetuate dominance. And so what I mean by that is, again, how do our identities grant us access and voice and space in ways that it may not grant other people? And so what does it mean for me to step back? How is that? How can that be seen as being passive? And how can that also be seen as relying upon women, for example, women of color, to do more labor when I step back, but then also not taking over. And there's no easy way to negotiate that, but it's something that we have to be thinking about constantly and trying to unlearn is the ways in which we're used to dominance and how that shows up in our work. And so I just use that as an example of a way to also be mindful of those pieces. So having said all of that, I just want to thank you all for joining us today. I just want to close our time with just talking about where we're going to go from here. So we envision this guiding document around the strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization as a living, dynamic document that it's revisable. It's not the final word on racial justice and decolonization, but we're opening up for critique, for feedback, for revision, and there'll be opportunities for you all to continue to engage with us, one of which may be convention coming up in March, but we're also hoping to have some virtual time between now and convention as a way for you to respond to and engage with the ideas, again, that we're generating. So I'll just ask if you have further feedback or questions beyond the Facebook Live today, please send them to me directly at pastpresident.acpa.nche.edu. Again, that's pastpresident.acpa.nche.edu. We look forward to engaging with you further. And again, thanks so much, and I'm so glad that we got a chance to share with you all this afternoon. So with that, I'll close this out and just say again, thanks for tuning in all.